Throughout the Middle Ages, timber was more than a building material. It was the backbone of homes, fortress gates, barns, bridges, siege engines, and even watermills. But scattered through lesser-known manuscripts, estate records, and guild notes is a technique that rarely gets discussed in modern restoration work. It was a way of preparing and joining timber that made medieval structures surprisingly durable and resistant to warping, rot, and mechanical strain. Many of the buildings that survived for centuries, long after stonework had cracked and metal hinges had rusted, benefited from this lost method. What makes it compelling is that it doesn't rely on modern preservatives or machinery. It relies instead on timing, grain knowledge, natural chemistry, and joinery precision. For survivalists, off-grid builders, and anyone fascinated by old-world craftsmanship, this forgotten timber technique offers a set of tools you can still use right now. The core of the technique centered on cutting timber at the right season and letting it cure slowly with sap still inside. Modern builders tend to kiln-dry wood or rely on pressure-treated lumber, but medieval craftsmen depended on the tree itself to provide longevity. They followed seasonal felling cycles, documented in monastic and guild writings that emphasized winter cutting. Trees felled during the coldest months contained less active sap, but more importantly, the sap they did contain had thickened to a resinous consistency. Instead of draining it immediately, medieval builders allowed the timber to cure with the sap in place. This resin acted as a natural preservative, slowing decay and making the wood less inviting to insects. Manuscripts from Central Europe describe builders stacking fresh timber off the ground under sloped roofs where cold winds could pass through slowly. The process took months, sometimes even years. But, the end result was wood that hardened into a denser, more stable material. The method also emphasized splitting rather than sawing to preserve grain alignment. Sawing across a log cuts through fibers and weakens structural integrity. Medieval craftsmen understood this instinctively. For beams, planks and posts, they preferred splitting logs along the natural grain using wedges and mallets. This produced timber with long continuous fibres that carried weight more efficiently and resisted twisting. Structures built with split timber survived hundreds of freeze-thaw cycles without the warping commonly seen in modern boards. In Scandinavia and Germany, buildings that use this method still stand today because the wood fibres remain intact. For anyone working with hand tools or building off the grid, this technique is still applicable. A split beam will always resist warping better than one cut against the grain. The joinery that completed this system avoided metal fasteners almost entirely. Medieval carpenters, relied on joinery techniques like mortise and tenon scarf joints and dovetail housings, not really for the sake of artistry, but because, metal fasteners were expensive, they tended to corrode and could even fracture when the weather froze and thawed. Wood-on-wood joinery, on the other hand, let these structures flex a bit during storms so they could settle naturally instead of just breaking apart. According to manuscripts from those old timber-building guilds, joint faces were rubbed with things like resin, animal fat, or boiled linseed. This helped the wood move a bit and kept moisture out. Pegs were usually made from hardwoods that would swell when damp, making the connections self-tightening. Really clever stuff. These joints, honestly, could last for centuries without any maintenance at all. Even today, modern timber framers use these same techniques to restore medieval barns, and, well, the method is still just as practical for off-grid shelters and small buildings as it ever was. The method became especially powerful when paired with natural surface treatments. Medieval timber builders used a finishing treatment rarely practiced today, even though it is documented in several rural manuscripts, a mixture of charcoal dust, tannin-rich water, and occasionally pine tar. When brushed onto cured timber, this mixture formed a thin protective layer that resisted insects and slowed moisture absorption. Charcoal acted as both a mild antiseptic and a water-repellent mineral, while tannins hardened into a dark, durable film. Combined with the resin within the timber itself, the result was wood remarkably resistant to rot. This wasn't decorative, it was functional. Many medieval granaries and storehouses used this coating because their contents couldn't risk damp or decay. This technique, still applies today for anyone who wants durable timber without relying on modern chemicals. If you want to replicate this medieval method, well, start by sourcing wood in the dormant season, if possible. Store it off the ground in a shaded, ventilated area and allow it to dry slowly. If you can, split larger pieces rather than cutting them. When shaping joints, avoid unnecessary metal hardware and instead use tight-fitting wooden pegs. For an external finish, try combining charcoal dust with boiled water that has steeped acacia bark, oak bark, or other tannin-heavy material. Brush it onto the cured timber in thin coats. The resulting surface won't look shiny or artificial. It will simply feel like toughened, darkened wood that, resists the elements. Examples from modern historical reconstruction projects show just how effective this technique still is, even today. Over in Norway, stave church restorations rely quite a bit on winter-cut timber that's cured slowly under airflow. And in Germany they've reconstructed medieval barns using split beams, which you see helps prevent warping in those damp climates. In the UK, experimental archaeologists have actually built entire halls using only wood-on-wood joints and charcoal tannin coatings. And, well, after years of exposure, the timber shows minimal decay, which is rather impressive, isn't it? A small cabin built using these traditional methods will often outlast modern pressure-treated structures, simply because the wood's internal fibres and natural chemistry are preserved rather than altered. This technique reveals, the deeper medieval understanding of nature and material science. It shows that medieval builders weren't just guessing. They observed how trees grew, how wood behaved under stress, and how long it survived when treated a certain way. Their method wasn't forgotten because it was inferior. It faded because, industrial sawmills and chemical treatments replaced the need for time and careful curing. But for anyone who values traditional skills, sustainable building, or historical resilience, the medieval timber technique found in old manuscripts remains, I'd say, one of the most powerful lessons from a world where durability really meant survival. If you want more lost techniques, forgotten engineering, and historical methods that still outperform modern shortcuts, subscribe to In the Beginning and share this video. These skills kept entire communities alive for centuries, and honestly, they're worth passing on.